Welcome to the Let Go and Be Free podcast, a podcast for those who grew up in an alcoholic or dysfunctional family. I'm your host, Ron Vitale, author of the Let Go and Be Free 100 Daily Reflections for Adult Children of Alcoholics series. If you'd like to learn more, feel free to visit letgoandbefree.com. And with that, let's get on with the show. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Let Go and Be Free. This week, we are going to focus on Step 8 of Adult Children of Alcoholics. There are 12 steps. If you have not heard the previous episodes, please go back and take a look. Listen to the other episodes of the steps 1 through 7. Step 8, if you're not familiar with this step, I'm going to read it twice for you so we can kind of just process it, process the words, focus on it, see what this is. So, Step 8, made a list of all persons we had harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. Again, I'll read it another time. Step 8, made a list of all persons we had harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. Now, I remember the first time that I came across, at this point it was decades ago, the 12 steps of ACOA, Adult Children of Alcoholics World Service Organization. I read this step and I was like, wait a minute. What about all the people who did things to me, when I was a kid? Why am I, making a list and, checking it twice and I'm going to, do all these things and be willing to make amends? I don't understand. Why am I doing this? Now, having been familiar with the 12 steps of AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, I understood, from people that I've known that were in that organization, they had mentioned this step to me. So it kind of made sense to me of like, oh, if you're struggling with an addiction, there are times where you may act out against people and, you're drunk and you don't know what you're doing, and you're going to make a list of all the things that you have done and you're going to make amends for that. That logically, I can understand that. That made sense. When it came to adult children of alcoholics and, me having grown up in a dysfunctional, family, I was like, wait a minute, I just don't understand. And as I went through and started attending the meetings, I understood that a lot of the behaviors I had learned, from my parents in times of stress or emotional crisis, there's a pattern that others who had grown up in similar environments would do the same. So we talked about this in the past. Maybe you would lash out at people. Maybe you withdraw, become emotionally unavailable. Maybe you're manipulative because that was your way of being able to get through when you were a kid and you were kind of pulling the strings, behind the scenes so that way you can get what you want to get by. Maybe you lied. Who knows? A whole list of things. But the important thing to know is that for this step, it's basically saying, okay, you know what? You got to cut the crap. You got to come to terms with all the personality quirks that you have and things that you have done to harm others in other relationships. That could be those within your family, could be, toward your parents, could be toward a sibling, an uncle, an aunt, cousin, whatever. Could be your coworkers, could be your spouse, could be a boyfriend or girlfriend, whatever. This is a difficult step for multiple reasons. One, when I was younger, the step 8 and step 9, and we'll talk about step 9 in a future episode, but I fell into one of the common traps for people going through the 12 steps. You get to this and you're like, oh, well, I have to go back in all my history and start making a list of all the people that I have harmed. Oh, conveniently, that happens to be, some of the people I've been in romantic relationships with. Wouldn't it be great to get in touch with them and see how things are going? And, oh, maybe they still might like me. Your brain works in very wild ways the first time you go through the steps. And I know that it's just It's not just me that had those thoughts, going through the first time I went through step 8 and hearing others. One of the, I guess, watch outs is, are you contacting someone, and again, that's going to be step 9. Are you putting a person on the list and then going to make amends to the person because you really want to make amends? Or is it more of a manipulative thing where you kind of want to check in on them and see how they're doing in their life? You want to see if there's a possibility of a spark that maybe you can get back together with them because maybe the time is right now. Your brain, again, does some pretty interesting gymnastics to kind of, get you in a certain frame of mind where behavior patterns that were dysfunctional and did not serve you well might still be so ingrained in you that you still fall into those traps. And let me explain that for a little bit. Often, people who are in ACA, ACOA, depending on which acronym you like to use, adult children of alcoholics, typically those of us that are in the organization or follow the steps do so because we're aware that there are unhealthy behavior patterns that we have latched onto. They helped us get through difficult time in our lives, but there's also some behaviors that are not necessarily healthy at all. Maybe addiction to adrenaline, like adrenaline, of that rush of infatuation, of falling for someone, even though you know that person's the not right for you, the bad person. And you get kind of trapped into, well, there's something, sexy or attractive or something about their personality. And the way your brain might be wired is subconsciously some of the characteristics that what you grew up with, one of your parents or so in those early relationships might have had characteristics like that. And your brain thinks, oh, well, that's like a healthy relationship, a healthy marriage. It's like someone who is needs to be saved. So I'm going to step in like a knight on a white horse and I'm going to save that person. Or maybe that person needs to save me. And we're only complete. We're two broken pieces, but when we come together, we complete each other. Like some of those fallacies, some of those romantic fallacies that you've often heard in various, movies over the decades. It can be very tricky that when you get to step 8 and you start listing all the persons that you have harmed, if you go back and start thinking about some of those people that you've been in romantic relationships with, the question is, why are you listing that person? What do you need to make amends for? And again, we'll get more into this in the episode where we talk about step 9. But sometimes making amends means respecting their space and not getting back involved in their lives and trying to drag them through your recovery process of healing from this trauma of growing up in a, either addiction in your family or dysfunction. And that's a really difficult, line to be able to see and to look in the mirror and be like, let me be honest. How do I really feel about this? That's very challenging. It's not something that is easy in any way to be able to go through because, there is something to be said about the excitement of like that infatuation of meeting someone and falling in love and you're head over heels and nothing else in the world exists and you escape for a while from the challenges of the everyday world, bills and problems and etc. That also means, your brain might be wrapped into that adrenaline, oxytocin of like, wow, somebody sees me the way I really am, and everything else in your life might just fall by the wayside. May not be spending time and energy on building the relationships that you currently have with your family, your friends, your coworkers. And it also might mean that you're taking critical time and energy away on working on yourself. Because if you're focusing so much on, well, step 8 says that, I need to make this list. Oh, well, you know what? I got to make this amend. Oh, step 9, that's easy. Let me just contact them on Facebook or send them a letter or call them out of the blue or whatever. And that could get you into all sorts of trouble. It's one of those things that I recommend that you work on step 8, you do your list, and you start thinking why you put that person on the list. Like, what did you do? Did you lie? Did you cheat? Did you whatever? Yell at them, have arguments? Did you treat them badly? Call them names? Like, whatever you did. That nobody else needs to know that but you. You put all those, down in your list. And I would say stop for a moment. And when I say a moment, like for some considerable amount of time, several days, let that list sit and then start thinking about the other steps. Meaning, go back through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 and kind of do like a touch base and see how are you feeling about those steps. And then when you come back to step 8 and you look at that list, you might be at a different position, a different point of view. And you could be more honest and say, oh, yes, I had done these things to these exes, let's say. But, in step 9, making amends, yeah, I have an ongoing relationship with this person. It would make sense for me to make amends. But if there was a bad breakup and if the breakup was initiated by the other person, the best thing might be to distance yourself. And the best way to make amends to that person is to honor the fact that they do not wish to have you in their life anymore. And that can be really difficult because, again, step 8 and step 9 can be really tricky because you're like, but it says that I have to make a list and I got to make amends. So I'm going to reach out to the person. And maybe the person doesn't want you to reach out. Some people you're going to know that because maybe it was just a bad breakup and it's too soon to reach out, or they specifically said, I never want to see you again. And, I'm just using that as an extreme example. But if that is the case, then I would say honor what that person has asked for. And if they ever wish to reach back out to you, then you could be receptive. And that could be making the amends to that particular person. It's more of instead of me going through this checklist of like, I've need to make amends to all these people. Oh, well, this person's on the list. I'm going through my list. I have to do it. The flip and the more, in my opinion, mature way of handling this list is there are some people that don't want you to reach out to them. Honor that. Give them that space that they ask for. And no need to complicate matters and kind of dredge up, baggage and hurt and pain because the person may not be wanting to hear from you. They may not even be on the same journey as you. And, this could go either way. If you had a bad breakup with someone, maybe they're still unable to see the personality quirks that they have and whatever they're dealing with, and they've ignored that. And then the question is, why do you want to get pulled back into that? Just because of the rush of infatuation and, you feel like you might get some attention from them? Is it worth it in the long run? These are some of the questions that, again, when you reflect back in some of the earlier episodes, when I had shared some of the skills that I learned in my early counseling sessions, asking yourself the question, is this healthy for me? Is this true? Is it true that me reaching out to this particular ex is going to, be something that's going to be fulfilling and healthy for them and for me? Is it healthy for me? The answer might be no. I'm going to, be potentially sucked back in to dysfunction or addiction or whatever else that person is going through. That's a real cause of concern. And I've seen many people fall into that they have the mindset of, well, I'm doing the steps, but the secret wish of their heart is, I want to get back together with that person again. I want to give it another go. This time I'm going to do it right. And I'm not saying that that is 100% impossible, but the odds are not in your favor. And I would say definitely take the time to think of this step in a way that is really true to your core. You know, it's very easy to lie to oneself and be like, oh, well, I'm only going to do this one time, or I'm only going to reach out to this person because, the last time we were together, or, I said some nasty things and I want to apologize. I mean, we can rationalize until, the cows come home. And I think anyone who's been in multiple relationships, and if you, are familiar with the, some of the challenges that those of us who grew up in a dysfunctional family, struggle with, you know where I'm coming from, on this. And then if you're new to this, this to me is a big warning sign that you definitely want to circle this step, and you want to reflect on it in a way that you give yourself some distance and some space to process what you're really thinking. Because the initial rush of, I'm going to do this good thing, maybe it's good for you and it's not going to be good for the other person. And my personal opinion is, having seen a bunch of people get wrapped up, in their past and sucked back into their past problems because they had they rationalized this step and said, oh, well, I'm going to do the right thing, and this time everything's going to be better. They were fooling themselves, and I've seen that happen. And in my own experience, when I went through these steps for the first time, I remember like, well, I'm going to reach out to this person, and then I'm going to apologize, and I'm going to show them that I've changed. Again, it's all ego based there. It's basically just trying to right a wrong in the past for a personal motive, with the hope and wish that maybe you would get back together again. Part of what I found to be amazing of the steps is that, as we mature, as we go on this journey, as we get experience, we learn that maybe the type of person that we thought was our, best partner, soulmate, whatever you want to call that person, is not the same as what that would be now, or let's say a year from now. We're changing, we're growing, and hopefully as you're going through the steps, if you're doing journaling, if you're going to therapy, you are dealing with and processing and healing from past trauma. And that has allowed you to open doors and maybe see, one, you don't need desperately to be with someone to be happy. That's I've seen that as well. It's like so many people are like, well, I can't go to the movies on my own, or I can't go out to dinner on my own. I must find someone, break up with somebody, they break up with them because the relationship becomes challenged, broken, whatever you want to call it. And then they just fall right back into another relationship time after time after time after time. And nothing is changing. And so the question is, are you willing to step back and see your own faults? In that particular example that I'm giving, it's maybe you're too needy. You're thinking that you have to be with someone, whereas you've not seen your own strength. You've not had the time, the quiet, to be able to really think and say like, hey, wait a minute. Why am I always attracted to a certain type of person? And it's another reason that I find this step 8 to be really good. When you're making that list, if you're doing this and you have decades of experience, or, let's say not even decades, if you've got years of experience, you might see like, oh, wait a minute, I dated a few people and they have these certain similar traits. Why is that? Why am I picking that same kind of person? What do I find, attractive in that type of person? Is that something that is going to help me where I am now on my journey? Is that person still going to be attractive to me now that I've, grown? I've started to process some of my past trauma. Is that person healthy for me? That's, again, some of these questions are not easy to answer. And again, what I like about the steps is that you could do this in secrecy and privacy. You don't need to talk to anybody about this. You can keep this close to your chest. You could keep it in your journal. You could write about it. You could think about it. You could process it. And you have time to go through this. Sure, first time you're going through the steps, you might want to barrel through 1 through 12. Done. Ching. I get the gold medal. Onward and upward. It's not how life is. You know that. I know that. Everybody knows that as you get older. You think, things might be a nice sequential process, but what happens when you have a difficult time in your life? Will you fall back into dysfunctional behaviors? Will you fall back into the comfort of behavior patterns that help you as a coping mechanism, but no longer are helpful or healthy now? How are you going to handle those things? What are the skills? What are the tools that you have to be able to go forward? As I'd said before in a previous episode, I see the 12 steps as that guide. It's a guide. It's a framework that helps you process your thoughts and say, checkpoint, wait a minute, time out. I typically get into a certain type of behavior. Let's say you withdraw when you get into an argument. You kind of pull back, go through the steps again, and kind of understand, why are you acting that way? Is it how you really want to be? How can you be courageous and accept, here is all who I am, faults and all, and then move forward in a way that's going to be a healthy way to settle a conflict, instead of either withdrawing and denial, or often it's the opposite, lashing out, yelling, screaming, fighting, but never getting to a resolution. So in these steps, I think it's important to use them as checkpoints throughout. Again, I do this on a daily basis, but for maybe you want to do it on a weekly basis. We're up to step 8. Have you even read the previous steps? Again, since we went through them? Why? Why not? Sometimes what I have found, taking pen and paper and writing with my hand forces me to really take time to process and think. Like if you were to write the steps out, or if you see the steps on a website and then you open up a word processor and you type out that step and then think of what it means to you and then write something about it in a daily journal, what would you gain? What would you learn? You're at step 8 now if you're listening to this podcast. Maybe you've just come in and you've only listened to step 8. Well, you could step back and go back 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, or go back to 1. What I'm trying to share here is that there's value in this framework, that you can go back daily basis, weekly basis, whatever works for you. But I find that daily or a couple times a week to be really helpful, that it helps me to kind of do that checkpoint in my brain of like, okay, where am I right now? How do I feel? What am I going through? Why am I struggling with X, Y, or Z? And then I have that tool of the steps to be able to go, let me think about this from a different perspective. How can I handle this in a more mature way instead of lashing out or denying and withdrawing or whatever the other coping mechanisms that maybe you struggled with, or what you learned. So, for me, when it comes to habits, when it comes to our behaviors, these neural pathways, the way our brains, the way we think, I had a therapist that said they're like grooves on a record, or the cassette keeps playing again and again and again. I like the grooves on a record, like the skip, like you just keep getting into that groove and you keep going round and around and around because that's what we learned. Well, how do you unlearn that? How do you break that habit? How do you say, that is no longer healthy for me, acting that way? I need to act a different way. What is that different way? Why? And that's the power of having being human and having consciousness and being able to think and question and learn. We have the opportunity to do things differently if we set ourselves up for success. I think that's the tricky thing, is that you get to a step like step 8 and you're like, well, I'm going to list all those people I've harmed and I'm going to make amends to them. Oh, pull out the old book and call up the old boyfriends or whatever. Again, I'm exaggerating, but I think you could see where I'm coming from, on this. There is the potential for this step to allow you to heal old wounds and grievances that maybe you may have not have talked to someone for decades or years, and maybe the time is right. But then there's also the opportunity to think and go, maybe I'm just being selfish and it's not right now for me to contact that person. I'm just trying to, get back into the ego loop of, infatuation and see if that person still finds me attractive or they still like me. What are your real, motivations in this step? And it could be different for each different person, on the step, and how you go through and process this and actually make amends could be different for each person. And that's part of what the next step is. But if you've gotten to step 8, I would say take some time, work on this step, back away, whatever list you've created, put it off to the side for a while. Go and look at the other steps. Read those steps again. Listen to some of the other episodes of the podcast and relive them. Again, I've mentioned this before. It's the beauty of it. They're still there. Just go back. You can listen to them. They're free. And then you might have learned something different because now you have the knowledge of what step 8 is, and getting back into some of those other steps of like, why was I thinking about these defects of character, in step 6? What about that? What are those defects of character? How is that interrelated to step 8? Because maybe a defect of character is you don't want to be alone and you find it difficult to be on your own. And so you'll you latch onto people and you're needy and you need them to be in your life because you're afraid that you were abandoned when you were young and people weren't either there for you physically or emotionally. That's a hard thing to be able to think through. So if that is true or something similar to that nature, go back, look at those previous steps, see what you've learned, and then apply them to the future steps. It's the framework that matters, the whole set of skills that you're learning here. Again, if the steps don't work from you, take what you want from them. Don't use the rest. But there are other useful aspects of what we're discussing, here. Even if you don't frame things up as steps, it does make sense to do self-reflection. What are your defects of character? How can you make amends to people? What does that really mean? Do you just say, I'm sorry? Do you make amends by just not even saying anything, but your behavior has changed toward a person and they notice it and be like, oh, thank you so much for listening to me, or whatever the situation is. Making an amends doesn't necessarily mean that you have to use words. It might mean how you're treating someone, especially if it's a difficult, situation. A thought comes to mind of like, if there was a couple and the couple's now divorced and they have children, and let's say the one person just really is mean, says mean things about the other in front of their children. Well, maybe that might change. And that person will go, you know what, that's not really nice of me to do. I should give that person the benefit of the doubt. I'm angry, I'm hurt because of the divorce, and I'm taking my anger out by pulling in, let's say, a child. That's not going to be good for the child. So what can I do? And that's something to talk about in therapy. That's something to write about in your journal. So again, I'm just using these examples as something that could be really helpful for you to be able to look at the step from a different perspective and then go back through the other steps. Give yourself some time before you move on to step 9. So again, I hope you find this episode helpful. If you'd like to learn more, you can visit letgoandbefree.com. And then again, just to remind everyone, we are coming up to a couple weeks. We'll be at my 1-year anniversary of this podcast. I am looking for, I'll just be honest, financial support to be able to pay the podcasting fees, the website hosting fees. So if you are so inclined, please purchase one of my books on any of the major online retailers, Amazon and Kobo and Barnes & Noble, Let Go and Be Free, Ron Vital, you can look them up, or just make a donation by becoming a subscribing member to the Substack, the weekly email list that goes out that announces, it's a short little newsletter that announces each episode that comes out on Saturdays. For the cost of like $5 a month, that's like what, 1 or 2 Starbucks coffees? That could help me keep this podcast going to be able to pay those hosting fees. So again, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate that you're listening and you're willing to be open to learning new ways. Thank you again, and be well.